So we have this metaphor that we use to understand ourselves psychologically, and it's the iceberg metaphor. You've probably heard of it. The basic idea is like an iceberg, where 10% of the iceberg is above the water and 90% of the iceberg is below the water. Your psyche has these elements that are above the water, but then all of this stuff that's below the water. And I think that when we come into contact with this metaphor, we generally make two mistakes. We make the mistake, the first mistake, which I'll call the Western mistake, which is saying, oh, when you first come into contact, when you first recognize there's all this stuff that I am that's out of my conscious awareness, the impulse that comes out of that often is to say, okay, well, I'm going to go down and I'm going to bring all of that material up above the water. And then when that's done, I'll be happy, I'll be okay, I'll be healed, I'll be enlightened, whatever it is that your particular trip is. The problem with that is you don't have any leverage to bring all that ice up over the surface of the water. And you can't, you wouldn't want to do it anyway. That's the good news. We tend to think of that as being shadow material, shadow being things that are in our psyche that we have sort of dissociated ourselves from, that we project outside of ourselves. But shadow material is actually in your waking consciousness. It composes your sense of self and your ego, or it's part of the composition of your ego. So when you see someone and you're just angry at them, right, but it's a stranger and there's no real reason for that, there may be all these dynamics that you're unaware of and that we tend to think of as being unconscious, but nonetheless that anger is present. That anger is the in. So your entire shadow complex, it's accessible through that anger. So that's above the water. What's below the water, at least in my use of this metaphor, what's below the water are things like how your cells exchange nourishment and waste, regulation of oxygen levels in your blood, breathing rate, your heart rate, how you're digesting food, right? All the different processes that are going on that are your brain. Trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of processes, literally every second, that compose you. The good news is you wouldn't want to be aware of all of that. There's just way too much stuff that's going on. You have no reason to be aware of all of that. You don't need to micromanage, this synapse right here. You don't need to micromanage that synapse. So again, that's the good news. And then what that becomes then, what's possible then, is not bringing all of that material into your ego, into your waking consciousness, but relaxing your sense of identity to begin to include all of these processes that you're composed of, to begin to include that within your sense of self. And in transpersonal psychology and integral psychology, we call that resulting self, we call that the centaur, or the body-mind, or I like the term body-heart-mind. And that's a very different sense of self than the sense of self that says, I've got to go down there and get control over all of these things that I don't have control of. There's a profound relaxation and a trust, a resting on these processes, and then allowing these processes to express themselves freely. So that's the option to the Western mistake. Now the Eastern mistake, and it may not be really an Eastern mistake, but at the very least it's a mistake that people who are Eastern practitioners or Western practitioners of Eastern spiritual paths make, is to say, an iceberg is made of water, and the ocean is made of water. And so if I just melt the iceberg down, then I'll be happy, then I'll be okay, then I'll be enlightened, then I'll be healed, again, whatever it is that your trip is. Now, I call this a mistake, but it's not exactly a mistake because it's actually possible. Now, unlike getting all of that ice up above the water, which you'll never actually be able to do, it's actually possible to melt down your ego consciousness and to become that ocean. And that's, people like Ramana Maharshi or Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj are exemplars of that, right? They're examples of having done that fully. Why I call it a mistake is because you don't have to do that. And if you listen to Maharshi or Maharaj, what they always will be saying is, you are already that. there isn't anything you could possibly do not to be the ocean. And so what I think is potential there is something very similar to what happens when we realize that, well, I don't want to be aware of what all of my cells are doing all of the time. And that is to say, okay, well, what I am already includes all of that. What I call this universal creative activity, the generativity that is and is at the heart of the universe. You are already that, however it is that you're showing up in this moment. So instead of trying to become that somewhere else or through some kind of a process, how deeply can you just relax into the knowledge of that that's already the case? And the way Alan Watts, the metaphor that Alan Watts uses for this, which I really love, is an apple coming out of an apple tree. You're like an apple that has come out of the process of this apple tree. So you're not born into the world. You come out of it when you're born. You become that apple. Why is this important? Why would you care about that? Because it means that you can actually rest into that identity. You can actually recognize in your direct experience, not as just an abstract thought, but in your direct experience, you can recognize that what you are and the generativity that's at the heart of the universe, this universal activity, those are not separable from each other. And life looks very different at that point. What it is that you can do looks very different at that point. How you feel feels very different at that point. And so in the next series of videos, we're going to start to look at how we get at that activity, how we sort of break down that mental sense of self, that ego sense of consciousness, the restriction of identity to the ego, and also why that's a good thing, why that would be something that you might want to do.